Perfect. All right. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. The title and topic of my talk is Types of Causation, and I'll be discussing this from the perspectives of philosophy of science and philosophy. One of the themes that is bringing together talks in this workshop today is a focus on causation insofar as it captures the cement of the universe, right? As Hume put it, and as Mackey used in the title of one of his books. In particular, there were two main questions that were asked. The first question is, what is this cement made out of? What is causation made out of? And the second question is, what is it useful for? In the philosophy of science literature, there are a number of pretty straightforward answers to the second of these questions. Causation is useful for all sorts of goals. The first goal is explanation. Philosophers of science often suggest that explanation is one of the most important things that scientists do, if not the most important thing. They also suggest that most of these explanations are causal. The idea is that causes explain their effects. So if we want to understand how a scientist is explaining a phenomenon, event, outcome in the world, this involves appealing to the causal structure or parts of that structure that are relevant to that outcome, right? Causes explain their effects. So what is causation useful for? Well, if you want to understand one of the most important things that scientists do, give causal explanations, it's extremely useful and important for that. A second reason for why causation is useful is it supports predictions. So if we know that a single main cause or set of causes produce or are responsible for an outcome, in many cases, we can use these to predict, forecast future events. A third reason for why causation is useful, and one that might get the most attention, is control. Causes are factors that provide control over their effects, and they're very useful to us for this reason. We see this in everyday life. We see it in scientific contexts. We don't just want to sit back and provide fancy explanations and predictions of stuff in the world. We also want to do something about that stuff. We want to get control over it, change things for the better. So in the context of medicine, medical researchers and physicians don't just want to predict diseases and explain them, they want to control them. They want to produce treatments, preventions, and cures that change things and make things better. And a fourth reason, although this is not an exhaustive list, is that causation is useful because it guides how we attribute responsibility and blame. If we're interested in what the cause or causes of a car crash are, it isn't just because we want to explain crashes, predict them, control them. We also want to know who or what is responsible for that crash. Now, when it comes to this first question, in the philosophical and philosophy of science literature, when we're focused on what is causation made out of, there's a common focus that a lot of this work takes. It's often focused on providing a definition of causation. Definitions of causation are intended to capture what the hallmark or characteristic features of causation are, right? This is very important. Once you have these features, you can use them to distinguish true, genuine causal relationships and causal systems from everything else, right? From mere correlation, spurious correlation. There are many different definitions of causation in the philosophical literature. Here are three examples. We have regularity accounts or definitions of causation. These were provided by Hume and Mackey on this slide. We have connected process accounts of causation articulated by Wesley Salmon and Dow, and we have interventionist accounts. The main proponent here is Woodward. Woodward's interventionist account of causation. However, if we want a more complete answer to this first question, what is causation made out of? It turns out that we need more than just definitions of causation. And one reason for this is that what we find is that in scientific and everyday life contexts, we refer to all different sorts of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems, right? In the explanations we provide and so on. And definitions of causation alone don't always well capture these types. So in a lot of my work, I'm focused on the life sciences. And if you look at the causal language that scientists use in this domain, you see that it's very rich and very colorful and diverse. They're often using it to refer to different types of rich, diverse varieties of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems in the world. So, for example, we find that scientists distinguish between causes that are structuring for an outcome versus triggering for an outcome. They distinguish between causes that are specific for an outcome versus ones that are less specific or non-specific. The distinction we've probably all heard of is between causes that are proximal to an effect, they're close to an effect, versus ones that are distal, they're further upstream. In other cases, they make distinctions with respect to how causes are organized and arranged together. They can be organized in a linear chain, in bow tie type configurations, in feed-forward loops, and in multi-input types of structures. In other cases, they distinguish between how causes are integrated together. Do they work together in a conjunctive sense where you need both, or are they integrated in a disjunctive sense where you only need one? One is individually sufficient for the outcome. In other cases, they use much more complex causal concepts and terms to refer to more complex causal systems. Here we see examples like mechanism, pathway, and cascade. We don't just see reference to these different types of causes in the life sciences, they're also studied in cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychologists study how individuals learn about these distinctions between systems that are integrated in different ways, like disjunctive and conjunctive types of integration. We also see some of these differences in the causal modeling literature. Cause being direct versus indirect is somewhat similar to referring to it as proximal or distal for an outcome. And it isn't just important to capture these to give a fuller or more complete answer to the first question, what is causation made out of? It also matters for that second question. If you want to say what causation is useful for, you have to capture these distinctions. Why is that? Well, scientists refer to these different causal structures and the explanations they provide, and different structures allow them to explain different things about the world. These different types of causes and causal relationships are responsible for different types of complex outputs and phenomena that they're interested in. And another reason is these different types of causes and causal systems give you very different types of control over the world. So giving a more complete answer, as it turns out, to both of these questions requires capturing these different types of causation. What I'm going to suggest is that what we need in order to capture these isn't just giving a definition of causation, but something that allows us to capture distinctions within causation. And so this is what I'll focus on in the rest of the talk today. How do we do this? How do we capture these different types of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems? What's interesting is that this hasn't been studied or addressed as much in the philosophical literature. And I think one reason for this is that there's just much more focus on how to define causation. And you might think that definitions don't give you a handle on this kind of diversity. One reason for why you might think that is that I haven't said anything about how to define causation, but you might think we can already start to see many of the differences here. So that starts to suggest that defining causality, saying what it is that defines causality, isn't necessarily the lens you need to capture these types. A second reason for why you might think you need something more or different than definitions of causation to capture this diversity is that there are a massive number of these distinctions within causation, and there's a pretty short list of definitions of causation. So there's not like a nice one-to-one with definitions to these distinctions. And a third reason is that you might think that underlying these different types, you could use one definition of causation as a kind of raw material, and then add other things out of which you could build these different types of causal systems. And that's partly what I'm going to suggest in this work. Interestingly, this is also suggested, you might think, by Mackey in his book, Cement of the Universe. Mackey states that instead of thinking that we need many different definitions of causation to capture causal diversity in the world, that instead, he says, I would rather say that there is a single basic concept of causing to which various frills are added. There is one common kind of causing with different accompaniments. And I think there's very much something right about this. Part of what we're looking for here, and a framework that I'll suggest, is that we can capture these differences by having a framework that adds these frills, the different bells and whistles that capture these differences on top of a definition of causation. So a first step that I'll suggest we can take to capture many of these types of causation is first distinguishing two different features of causation, causal relationships. A first feature are what I call primary features of causation. Primary features of causation are features that make a relationship causal. Different definitions of causation this is exactly what they're aiming to do. They're telling us what the primary features of causation and causal systems are, right? Is it a regularity in the world? Is it a connected process? Is it an interventionist counterfactual? Causal relationships have other features besides primary features. They also have what I call secondary features. Secondary features of causation are features that are relevant to the causal behavior of the system, but they don't make it causal. So if you have a relationship that's more or less specific, a causal relationship that's more or less specific, well, specificity doesn't make it causal. That's a feature in a way that it can vary. That's a way that causal relationships can vary. Causal relationships can be organized in different ways. None of those organizations makes them causal systems. So part of what I'm suggesting here is that one way to capture these types of causation is to focus on these secondary features. They're not features that make the system causal, but they're features that are very important for the behavior that they produce. And part of what I'll do is I will suggest that there's at least 3 different classes of these secondary features that we can start to examine and look at. We can identify different secondary features at the scale of a single causal step, at the scale of many causal steps and how they're organized together. And then I'll suggest how we can also capture these more complex causal systems. So how do we capture these different types of causation? Well, first, appreciating that they differ with respect to secondary features, and we'll take a look at what some of these are. So suppose you have a candidate cause X, candidate causal relationship. Suppose also it meets your preferred criterion for causation. It meets your definition of causality, right? You have a causal relationship. X is causally relevant to Y, right? You often want to know a lot more than that, right? That's a first step, but we often want to know more than just is X a cause of Y. This is where we see some of these secondary features. We want to know, well, what kind of cause is it? What other features are there of this type of causal influence? So part of what I'll suggest is that there are some secondary features that you can define and see at a single causal step. They can take place across many steps, but you can at least see them at a single step. And I call these types of causal influence. So what are some examples of these? A first example is speed. Causal relationships differ greatly with respect to the time scale on which they take place. Causes differ wildly from each other with respect to the speed with which they produce their effects. So in the life sciences, we see this in the sense that enzymes are producing metabolites on the time scale of nanoseconds. Genes are producing proteins on the time scale of minutes. Our immune systems respond on the time scale of hours. If you're interested in COVID and how it spreads through the population, you're looking at days, you're looking at weeks. If you're interested in geological processes, it's millions of years. So there's very different time scales on which causal relationships and causal processes take place. Why does this matter, right? Why should we care about this? A first reason for why it matters is this specifies a sense in which causes can give us very different types of control over outcomes in the world. If you have two different drugs that cause pain relief, and one of them causes pain relief in 2 minutes, the other causes pain relief in 2 hours, that's a very different type of control, right? If you have a patient who's going to have maximum pain right now or in 2 minutes, you're going to give the first. If you have a patient who's going to have maximum pain in 2 hours and you need to start the dosage now, you're going to use the second. Part of what this also helps capture is that these secondary features are objective features of causal relationships in the world. We don't get to control or choose the speed with which a cause produces its effect. What we do have say over is which cause we choose to intervene on. We might choose one over another because we want the kind of control it gives, right? We want control over the time scale that it matters for. A second reason for why this matters is if you want to capture really complicated outputs in the life sciences, you have to pay attention to speed. It matters for how systems are producing things like oscillations because they're exploiting delays at different time scales, right? So you need a delay in causal steps to produce something like an oscillation and to explain something like an oscillation. Other things like just-in-time production. And another reason here is that sometimes you can remove factors as being less relevant for the explanation because they're on a time scale that's too slow. You're interested in something that's on a shorter time scale. So it's also a way to guide causal selection, what's more or less explanatory for an outcome, what causes you should select that matter more for the outcome. And then a final reason here is biases. Part of what cognitive psychologists have studied and identified is that humans can be pretty biased against slow causes. If you have two causal factors that are equally stable in producing an outcome, but one of them is slower, they're much more likely to say that that slow cause isn't really paradigmatically causal. They're less likely to view it as a real causal relationship. Why does this matter? If we want to communicate slow causal processes to the public, things like climate change, things like the spread of COVID, it's really important to keep this in mind, right? Our audience might be biased against viewing these as legitimate causal systems and causal processes. So it matters for how scientists, experts, and other people are communicating about causal systems. So speed is a first secondary feature. A second one that I'll discuss here is irreversibility and reversibility. Some causal relationships are reversible. A great example is the light switch on the wall and the light in the room, right? Turn it on and off all you want. Gene expression, same way. Some causal relationships aren't like that. They're irreversible. So the toy example is I have a glass vase. I accidentally hit it, knock it over, and it breaks. There's no way for me to undo my hit such that I can restore the glass vase back to its original state. That's an irreversible causal relationship. We see lots of both types of these in the life sciences. Irreversible ones are cases where you have cell death, right? You kill a neuron in the brain. In many cases, it's not coming back to life, right? Unfortunately, human death, right? If a human is poisoned and this results in death, there's no coming back from this. That's irreversible. Those are cases that are non-functional. In other cases, it's functional. Sometimes you want irreversible causes. We see this in stem cell differentiation. You have a cell, it differentiates into one type, and there's no going backwards. Or apoptosis, programmed cell death, right? Sometimes it's time for a cell to die, and you want that. Why does this matter? These are systems that give you very different types of control over outcomes in the world. We're often very careful with irreversible causes, right? The effect is permanent, and so we're very careful about setting these off. Versus ones that are irreversible, which we often see in artifacts, right? It's pretty useful to us to have our cars made up out of reversible causal relationships. A third example here is material continuity. This is an interesting one. In this case, the cause transmits material reliably to its effect. We see this in biological systems, like metabolic pathways. There's some material in a metabolite that is reliably transmitted to the next and the next and the next. Why does this matter? Well, scientists have realized that they can exploit this when they study these systems, and they do this with tags and tracers. So you can put a tag or a tracer on your cause, and then you can watch it as it moves through the sequence of causal steps. So radioactive isotopes are used as tracers to study metabolic pathways, ecological pathways, neural pathways, and so on. Why does it matter? Well, you only get to use those methods when you have a system with this secondary feature. Many systems don't have it. So if you think of dominoes that fall over in succession, right? In some ways, that's like our paradigmatic causal system. Of course, it's a causal process, but there isn't any material that reliably starts with domino 1 that makes its way all the way to domino 20. So this is a feature that isn't a primary feature of causation. It's a feature that a causal system can have or not. Causal relationship can have or not. There are a number of other secondary features that are discussed in the literature that you can see at a single step. Other examples are specificity. There's at least 2 types that are commonly discussed in the philosophical literature. Stability is another example. So these are secondary features at the scale of a single causal step. There's others that we can only see when you pay attention to many causal steps, and in this case, how they're organized and arranged together. So causal systems can have very different causal topologies or causal connections, right? None of these connection patterns make them causal, right? But they're very important for the behaviors they produce. Examples are, of course, a linear chain. We can have feed forward and feedback loops. We can have bow tie configurations. We can have single input systems where you have a single main cause to many effects, and multi-input systems, many causes, many different effects. Why do these matter? They explain very precise and distinct types of outcomes. So these feed-forward loops are extremely common in biological and neurological systems. They can explain things like how the system filters out noise and how it has a kind of sign-sensitive delay. The bow tie system is fragile, right? If you shut down the knot or the node of the bow tie, the whole thing's shut down. If you have a bypass, you don't have that problem. You're more robust. The single input system is often referred to as having a master regulator. So you've got that one cause. It controls all of these effects, and usually they're integrated and doing the same functional thing for the system. So you've got a master regulator with your single input system, and your multi-input is used to capture combinatorial decision-making. So you have many different causes. They need to be in a certain configuration to get this outcome of interest. I'm also putting causal integration here. This is a distinction with respect to how multiple causes are integrated together when they produce an effect of interest. So this is a kind of second category. We had types of causal influence. These are types of causal connections or causal topologies. The third category are more complex causal systems. The way that I understand these is that they're built up out of the first 2 types, but then they also have a lot of other things going on. So if you take a causal topology and then you add in those types of causal influence, you can build more complex causal systems, or you can take a complex causal system that scientists are interested in, break it into its parts. The first 2 steps were like parts of these systems. So mechanism is one, it is the most common causal term, at least as philosophers of science see it, that's used in biology, neuroscience, and there's a lot of debate about how to understand the notion of a mechanism. One common view is that they are systems that are analogized to machines. They have lower level parts that all interact to produce a single main effect of interest. There are other more complex causal terms like pathways that differ from this. So mechanism is analogized to a machine. Pathways are analogized to roadways, highways, and city streets. Far more abstract, don't need the lower level detail. You have these higher level steps. So think ecological pathways, developmental pathways, metabolic pathways, vascular pathways, blood vessels. And a third more complex causal concept and system here are cascades. The most important feature of cascades is they explode. They have sequential amplification, right? So you have cell signaling cascades here. This is a cascading reaction in physics and in chemistry. And the way that COVID is spread through the population involves sequential amplification. Cascade has its own analogy too. It's the snowball effect, the ripple effect, right? Really nicely captures single main cause you're starting with, and then it just explodes, right? It can run out of control. Part of what this helps capture is that the causal language we use and the specification of the features of these systems is important for communication. So if we want to communicate the spread of COVID to the public, it's not that helpful to call it a mechanism for many reasons. It's much more helpful to call it a cascade, if we want to highlight the fact that this is a disease that amplifies, balloons out, and spreads through the population. And that's often exactly what we want to communicate. So causal systems are very different with respect to the features that they have, right? And sometimes we want to highlight or communicate one of these features over another. The words we use, the analogies they're associated with, all matter for this reason. Okay, in conclusion, here's a slide that captures a way to think of a kind of taxonomy of these different types of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems. Here we're looking at secondary features at the scale of a single causal step, types of causal influence, types of causal topologies, types of causal systems, right? Part of what I'm suggesting is that if we want to say something about what causation is made out of, right? What is the cement of the universe made out of? Well, there's primary features, and there's a whole lot of secondary features that matter for capturing the diversity of causal systems in the world. And it doesn't just matter for a project that sounds more philosophical, right? What is the cement of the universe made out of? If you want to say why causation is useful, you have to capture these. Why? Well, they give different explanations of outcomes in the world. Scientists rely on some of these systems versus others when they want to explain different things about the world. In addition to this, these give us different types of control over the world and over outcomes that we're interested in. All right, thank you.
So I really like your taxonomy and agree phenomenologically, but I'm wondering about what it actually says about the kinds of wormhole models we can have for causality. Like, if I think of Python programs as my model of causal things, I feel like I could write programs that have many of those properties, and it wouldn't somehow involve coming up with new theories about them and just being like, I write different programs with different patterns. And so I guess the question is like, do you feel like this taxonomy could be some, kind of realized in a straightforward uniform system, or does it actually require different theorizing for each of the pieces?
The way that I think about it is that part of what we need for progress in both areas is to take some of the ways in which scientists are thinking about causation that is less formal, but that appears to track important distinctions within causation, and then seeing if those can be formalized. In a lot of this work, there's interplay and discussion between philosophers of science and cognitive psychologists. And in my view, the philosophers of science need to capture what scientists are telling us about how humans study and identify causation in the world. But in some cases, in these philosophical frameworks, you can see distinctions more easily that you can then in a scientific context. So part of the way that I view this message is, if you look at the life sciences and some of these methods that are maybe less mathematical or more experimental, there's really important differences that these researchers are identifying. Can they be formalized mathematically? This is up to you and others, I think, to help, right? Our areas of expertise are not, taking up, they're kind of overlapping. So yeah, and so part of what I'm kind of bringing to the table is, hey, here's what life scientists say are important. I mean, material continuity isn't something you can easily think of in a causal Bayes net, right? But we need to maybe talk about that. Can you mathematize that? It's definitely non-trivial and not straightforward. So it's partly to start a communication about, maybe, can we, should we? But these are distinctions that matter for experimental life scientists. And then we also have a philosophical framework here that's based off of these formal mathematical causal methods, interventionist causation. So how do we bring all of these together to make progress? Mm-hmm.
I apologize, this is not a very well-formed question because it's not something I don't understand very well, but I'm wondering where concepts like autopoiesis would fit into this framework. You have some of these sort of very complex systems that come up, or at least argued to come up a lot in life sciences and maybe arguably in cognition as well. Because it seems like they sort of almost elevate what you're calling the secondary features and kind of denigrate the primary features. But like I said, I don't understand autopoiesis, so. Yeah.
So autopoiesis as in programmed cell death.
Not apoptosis, but autopoiesis, so sort of like self-caused systems, these kind of like second order cybernetic kind of ideas.
So the way that I think about taking causal concepts from the sciences and trying to make sense of them involves appreciating that scientists sometimes disagree with each other about how to understand causality, whether a system is causal or not, and they can't always be right. So sometimes we need to come in and say, look, you're calling this a causal system, but are you sure yet it doesn't have these features? Or in other cases, you're using this term to refer to this system, is that you use it differently over here. So there's a little bit of a normative project where if you take kind of principled reasons in, you can come in and make, kind of make some suggestions about what's not principled. In other cases, I mean, and a main motivation for this work is that scientists are very successful and they 100% have principled methods that we're trying to capture. But it's not just a descriptive project. It's also this normative project as well. So I do think they need, I mean, before you even talk about a system like autopoiesis or anything else being causal, you really do need to say, what does causation mean? You need a definition. And then yeah, the fun work comes into saying, okay, what is it about this system that matters for your target of interest? Why can you set aside all of these other factors as less relevant? But yeah, I would have to look at it particular examples, but that's more of the stepwise process for how some of these discussions take place.